Dear colleagues, I'm grateful to each and every of you who comes in time. It's great. And now we'll start and hope our colleagues will join us soon. So, the previous conversation was actually about PIMI, about information threats, about narratives, and we continue this talk talking about a very specific narrative. One of the most damaging narratives about Ukraine is the myth of being the most corrupt state. This label weakens international support and erodes trust within Ukrainian society. And so the question is, how can we instrumentalize corruption, shifting the focus back to solving a real problem rather than using it as a tool to discredit states and civil societies that often happens to Ukraine? What mistakes should be acknowledged, what lessons have been learned, how we can rethink our approach to communicating corruption and institutional accountability in ways that are honest, constructive, and capable of changing perception. And I'm honored to introduce our today's speaker, Ilana, who is a senior strategist specializing in political risk, reputation management, public policy, and negotiation. With over 20 years of consultancy experience in Brussels, she is former UN peacekeeper and senior advisor who has mediated and negotiated intricate international issues and advised on defense, security, trade, and energy matters. And please, it's my honor to introduce Andrii Borovyk, an expert in good governance, anti-corruption, and European integration, with extensive experience in implementing systemic reforms. He has worked as an investment analyst and led a reform initiative at the Prosecutor General Office. And since 2016, Andrii has been with Transparency International Ukraine, serving as executive director since 2019. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We were sort of debating what we would talk about, and then we decided that we just had so much to talk about, we're just going to have a conversation, and if you like it, fine, and if not. Let me explain a bit how come I'm here and what I've been doing on this issue, and then maybe, Andrii, you can take up from there, explain what you've been doing on it. So, I became interested in the issue of corruption and how it was being used internationally against Ukraine, because in 2023 already, we began to notice that it was being instrumentalized, if you want to put it that way, especially in the US against Ukraine, and holding up bills in Congress and to aid Ukraine with the Republicans and other right-wing elements saying, don't give them any money and don't give them any help because they'll just use it corruptly or sell it to somebody else or something like that, which is a rather absurd idea for a country at war. So we became very interested in this. I belong to a small group that has a lot of high-level capacity in areas also related to corruption, and we decided to launch a project financed by the Soros Foundation to look at how corrupt or not uncorrupt, in as much as we could understand it, Ukraine really is, and how disinformation on corruption is being used. Apart from visiting Ukraine and meeting with many people, one of the things that we did was commission a communications company to create an AI dashboard, which was focused upon corruption with keywords and an open media and social media, so that means largely Twitter or X as it's now known, but a lot of other open media. And to their surprise, and these are experts in disinformation and AI, they found that 60% of information or data about corruption in Ukraine could be considered disinformation, and that most of it was coming from Russia, often through Africa to the US, and then coming back into Europe. It was really quite fascinating to us. We wrote several reports on the issue. We briefed many senior people, gave media interviews, but it showed the degree to which the whole idea of corruption has been used and is being used against Ukraine to both undermine it as a legitimate state and also to try and prevent countries and individuals from helping it. So that's my background, and that's what I'm doing here right at this very moment. Over to you, Andrii.
I'm leading one of the probably most well-known internationally anti-corruption global movements, Transparency International, the local chapter in Ukraine. Despite that the main idea is to fight the corruption, I prefer to say that we can only limit the corruption. We cannot fight it fully. It's just impossible in any country. But in Ukraine, we're working on improving the transparency, accountability, and good governance, because corruption is a lot about the accountability. The more you hold the politicians accountable, the less there is opportunities for corruption. We work in a number of topics, but I'm not going to cover all of them. Regarding the topic of our panel, I remember when I the first time noticed that in the current war with Russia, how they use in the narrative about the Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe. So the first time when I faced it personally, it was in May 2022. Immediately, actually just a month, probably even less, after the US at that time started providing to Ukraine more heavy weapon, I started receiving the calls from and requests for comment from American journalists or a journalist based in the US. And I remember one of the conversations saying that, like, okay, Andrew, do you think that there is opportunity for corruption during the war? I said, no, of course there is, because lots of information might be closed. The next question was, okay, there is a chance that the artillery that US providing to Ukraine will appear somewhere at the Middle East. I said, like, honestly, I doubt. I don't have any information, but let's think logically. This is May 2022. We lost at that time the control over the Black Sea, so our seaports is not operating. We don't have borders, open borders with Russia and Belarus because this is an enemy. And we have mainly only the borders, which are more or less open, is with European Union countries. So I told him, do you think that there is a high chance that the Slovakian, Hungarian, Polish border police would not notice a tiny small HIMARS going smuggling through the border? He said, that was a guy, he said, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Okay, but what about the guns? I said, look, if you're trying to find somewhere the corruption and expose Ukraine that we are stealing the guns which are provided by Americans, even if it is true, this is only a few thousands of them and they will not influence on the global security, even if it is done, because we have our own. The second thing, and then it was about a couple of weeks, I haven't seen any consequences of those comments because there was nothing to talk about. The second wave was in September that year, with exactly the same questions, despite that for the 3 months before there was no any information about smuggling the weapon or reselling it at the black market. The same year, another probably line or weapon which they tried to use, they invented this stronger message that Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe. I started searching, like, where this data coming from, why they saying this, what is the background. And honestly, the Russians were quite innovative in this sense. So it's not just something and then without the background. There is some background analytical which they used as well. Transparency International each year, not us, but our head office in Berlin, publish Corruption Perception Index. This is an index about the perception of the corruption. This is important to remember. And each year it is published, and Ukraine in this list have 35 points out of 100, 100 no corruption, 0 only corruption. So we have pretty low points, but comparing to what it was 10 years ago, we have a good progress. So what the Russians did, they took the countries of the Council of Europe, at that time it was 42 countries, ranked them with the CPI, and Ukraine was at the 41st place. 42nd was for Russia. And that's how they were explaining this narrative. Later that year, when the new index was published and Ukraine got higher in the ranking, they stopped doing that because there was already a number of other 5 or 7 countries who were below us in the ranking. So they're not only doing it, inventing the problems or inventing the messaging, but sometimes they even using the open information of, I still believe we are quite reputable organization results, in order to explain why Ukraine is a corrupt shithole and you should not help them. And that's made me to think, okay, how are we going to talk about the corruption as a problem? Because corruption is our problem in the sense of the efficiency and in the sense of the surviving the state. Because every stolen dollar, hryvnia, euro, whatever it is, it's actually stolen dollar, hryvnia, or euro from potentially more mines, artillery, HIMARS, or other stuff. And here, I think there is lots of evidence what need to be done, but I think that many of us were making lots of mistakes in the past and continue searching what is the right answer for this question.
I couldn't agree with you more. I would just add some context. Context, as we know, is everything, but in the specific case of Russia, context is actually even more meaningful. What do I mean by that? That Russia always sees the narrative, the information war as context, and that is as important in the doctrine, the military doctrine, as the guns and the bombs and the soldiers. So the context, the narrative has been running a lot longer than 2022 or even 2014. I would say it's been running since 1991, since Ukraine declared independence to a certain extent. And here it's really crucial to understand that it's been running inside Ukraine as much as outside Ukraine. Inside Ukraine, it was, especially with the Russian-speaking media, it was all about, you're so corrupt you can't be independent. You can't run yourselves. You can't really be a proper state. And when it fails each time, so you know, it's trying to control through corruption. But we all know, in 1990, there was a student revolution. 1991, for the wrong reasons probably, the then communist regime declares independence. 2004, you already had the Orange Revolution. You're trying to fight this. Each of these things for Russia was a huge setback in its attempt to convince Ukrainians that you can't be independent because you're so corrupt. And of course, then comes the Revolution of Dignity and 2022. But you have to understand that it is as important what has happened to you inside the country with the narrative about corruption as it is outside the country. Now, is this to say that there's no corruption in Ukraine? No, there is. You have a problem with corruption, so do many other states for that matter. But we're talking about you right now. So the core question, as we came down to it, is how do we talk about corruption and the successes in fighting corruption as we do talk about anything else? Because you have to understand, every single time you put out, any of you, a press release that says that you have successfully brought to order, you have successfully arrested a judge, you have successfully found, sort of a head of mission or a head of an agency has been corrupt and they've been arrested, that is taken by Russia and turned against you immediately. It immediately becomes, look how corrupt it is. Just look.
About that, I think that one of the, I will start with only my phrase to make it clear that we are not talking, I'm sure, that the journalists, civil society, and in general, should not talk about the corruption. No, we should, because the problem is here. It's maybe slightly worse than in other countries. I mean, in Europe, but not the whole Europe, because it's not only cannot be perceived as the one state. So we should talk about this. For this, we have very good investigative journalists. We have very good CSO groups who are monitoring and talking about that. But what is important to remember, and us, only us, we cannot solve the problem of how we're going to talk about the corruption and in order to make it right. But my personal opinion is that one of the potential problems is actually how problem of corruption is communicated by the state leadership. Usually, if we will look at their interviews, sometimes they are asked about the corruption, not so often. They denying existence of this problem. You heard it from the president, you heard it from his administration saying that the corruption is not here, lots of the people left, we fight the oligarchs and oligarchs are not here anymore, nobody talks that there is a high chance that the new oligarchs will be raised because of the reconstruction, but it will be after we will win the war. So they just denying the problem. And what happens next? When you deny the problem, there is no state-level policy how to talk about the corruption, just denying its existence, but it's still here. Then most likely what the Russia do, they read the news that the head of the Supreme Court was arrested. For me, it's a success. It means that our reforms we were doing last 10 years is bringing the results. But for Russians, is to say, look, even the head of the Supreme Court is corrupt in this country. What you can talk about the others? But actually in the legal system is the third person by influence in the state. But I think that what needs to be changed is that we must admit, the leadership must say that yes, we have the problem of corruption, and these are the steps we are taking in order to fight this problem. And the second thing, we should stop even using the word that Ukraine is corrupt. We should say that Ukraine is a country that is fighting corruption. Yes, this is not about the result. This is not about static thing like the Ukraine is corrupt or not corrupt, but this is actually true that we are fighting and trying to solve this problem. That's what we can do, I guess.
I think that's one thing that we can think about. Another thing I would, let me just tell you what we found from our dashboard so you understand why we have become so, if you want, strong on this issue that we must stop talking with the word corruption. So, as I noted, there's a passage that these troll farms are used. We noted, for example, that there was a troll farm, don't know if it was a troll farm, but that for a while something like 8% of all disinformation was going through Ethiopia. Ethiopia? Why on earth would Ethiopia be talking about it? Well, Ethiopia was talking about it because it was being sent from somewhere else. There's a troll farm there, and it goes on. Now, your enemy is a very clever enemy. They, for example, found out that it wasn't useful to them to run a Twitter feed that was very anti-Ukraine and anti-Western in Washington, D.C., under the previous regime, of course. We're not talking this regime. And let's talk about it as a regime, not an administration. Then they were running, they realized it was bad news. Don't bother doing it. What did they do instead? They put out all of this sort of information through the Twitter feed in their embassy in South Africa. And there, the Tucker Carlsons and the Joe Rogans and all your right-wing influencers in the US, they were taking a direct feed from South Africa. And they were bringing it into the conversation inside the US, which was then coming back into Europe. Never, ever, as George W. Bush put it, misunderestimate them. They really are incredibly clever about that. I'm putting it out there because I would say stop using the word corruption. I know it's difficult for Transparency International, but start using mismanagement. In fact, start saying Russia is corrupt, we're mismanaged. I think you'll end up with a really good outcome. First of all, you're pushing them into the corner. Second of all, you're making a differentiation between them and you. They're corrupt, you're mismanaged. Because if they're saying that you're corrupt, what are they? I mean, let's all be very honest about this. But it's the word itself that is being used. stop using the word, to my mind, is a very important step to take.
I cannot agree with this, but as you said, we cannot stop using it, right? And by the way, the case with Russia is a very good example that if you are corrupt, so if you are corrupt, so it means the same is like Russia. But I tend to say that for us, corruption it's an issue for survival of the state, and for Russia, it's an issue for the survival of the state, but vice versa. Because without the corruption, Russia will not survive. From one hand, from the other hand, corruption within the military helps us a lot. So let it be there, at least for now. But for Ukraine, this is a problem which we need to solve because it's actually, diplomatically, it's not helping us to fight the Russians. I mean, not the messaging, but the actual corrupted use of money and the state budget, because it means that our friends and relatives who are at the front line receiving less of munition they need for fighting with Russians. What I agree is we cannot name everything that you, when you read on the media, when you read on the social media, and you think that this is a corruption, it can be, just think about it like for a second, can be a mismanagement, real mismanagement, not evil mismanagement. Because the quality of the labor market is going down in Ukraine. It's not improving, let's be honest. Look, millions of of Ukrainians are outside of the country. It influences not only on just an old-fashioned labor market, but tech companies, CSOs, the government as well. The whole work by the government is not done by the politicians, it's done by the civil servants who also left, and the quality of these people is not growing as well. So sometimes it can be really a mismanagement. But when you see that there is overpayments or double prices in construction projects, it's definitely not a mismanagement, it's definitely corruption. And of course you need to scream, shout, and do whatever you can when you see such things. But sometimes I think that there still can be mismanagement. I was talking to one of my colleagues from European countries, and she told me that there is in their media, I think it was in Germany, you barely can find the word of corruption when you're talking about the government. Mostly this is about the mismanagement. And that's why Germany's perception is also lower. But if you look at the sociology polls, by the way, lots of Germans believe that these national companies like Volkswagen and others, they corrupt in the government. In what way, they cannot say it. In our case, every case of the mismanagement, we always name the corruption. Everything when it happens not in a way that we want it to happen, it means there is somebody corrupt somewhere there in Kiev and he's getting bonuses from that. But honestly, it's not always true.
The issue at the end of the day, as I say, is what is being done with the information outside and how it's affecting your standing in the war. And you've got to understand that this is part of the war that you're fighting. It's not just about corruption. And we've got to find a way to talk about it. Maybe let's put it out to you all out there. What word would you use? How would you explain it? And if you don't have that, does anybody have a question at this point? Yeah. Let's take a first round of questions, maybe.
Hello, thank you for interesting talk. I'm interested when talking about corruption problem in this context, what you described. Did you ever experience from the government or from the supporters of government, like the public in the public debate, that you are like the attacks, like you are useful to Russia or something like that? Because we had such cases in our country when talking about the problems about our state. We sometimes were blamed that we are useful weapon in the hands of our adversaries. So how you navigate that conflicts, maybe because this might also be part of the reputation of civil society actors and in general those who are fighting against the corruption as a problem?
If talking about me or my team, I would say that we usually receive the comments from the politicians saying that, oh, that's what you're doing, it can be perceived as a pro-Russian position. But it's not often. But maybe this is because we are more working on the expert level, not on the, let's say, getting the wider audience, wider public. But I know about the cases you're talking about. So sometimes everything that you're saying that goes in contradiction with what the government is doing can be easily named and is sometimes easily named that, oh, you're against the state, you're the pro-Russian. But I don't see that they're using it quite often because we already been there. We all the Sarasata, right? And we all the Soros guys. And we all the against. So saying this is quite strong, but I see more that this is pro-Russian is more used in the political fight, and you know about whom I'm talking about. But unfortunately, talking about the civil society and journalists, there is pressure. It's not always at the national level, but at the local level for sure. This is the easiest way to label somebody, and it influences on us a lot because labeling somebody is doing the pro-Russian job immediately, even if you know this person, actually lowers your trust to that, and they know this. Unfortunately, then this is one of the things I was talking about. What the government should do. This is what they should not do. But the government is not one person; it's different groups. And there is, of course, the questions why some of the people are still in the administration or the ministerial positions when they need to be fired many years ago, not even months ago. But they're still there because for some way they're useful for the leadership there. So sometimes it happens, but we are not facing it personally. But every time when it happens, I think, oh God, again they're doing that. This is just wrong. It doesn't help us to fight with Russia, and doesn't help us to save the state, the place where we can then continue all our internal fights, fighting the corruption, fighting for different political beliefs and other stuff. First of all, we need to save the state, to have the place where we can live and where we can do all our wonderful reforms which we love to do.
I'm not sure I have an answer because I think it's very specific to what Andrii was saying. I think that the way, when I think about your situation here, I've just come from Kyiv and somebody pointed out that it's extremely difficult to both create democracy and fight a war at the same time. And there's just no doubt about that. There's very few successful examples of it, especially not when you're doing it in a very short period of time and at the same time. You know, in the US, it's very nice to go around the world telling other people to do it, but, you know, they did it over about 30 years, really. You know, the 4th of July was the end of a long war that had started before, and the Constitution came 10 years later, and then many amendments on the back of that as they worked through it and found out how to do it. So it's extremely rare that you can do a war and democracy at the same time. But you have to work on democracy, not least because it's your only way of saying, I'm fighting, and justifying to yourself, I think, why all of this pain is being inflicted upon you is because I want a different life. If it was just about nationhood, if you think about it, then you go, okay, he's a corrupt Russian, I'm a corrupt Ukrainian, he's a corrupt Belarusian, you know, wala, wala, wala. But it's not about that. There's a reason that you've called it a revolution of dignity. The dignity is about you. The dignity is about you not being coerced into doing things and living a life of freedom and democracy and honor, not just dignity. And for me, honor is another word you might want to be thinking about apropos corruption, that, you know, sort of somebody is dishonorable as opposed to being corrupt. And I think, you know, if I were a man, thankfully I'm not, I would find that a lot more insulting than being told I'm corrupt. If you're dishonorable, I don't think that's very nice, do you?
About the corruptions, I have a kind of a joke that sometimes when the Western journalists asking the question, they're just asking the question, I have a feeling, and I'm honestly saying that I have a feeling, guys, that when you're asking me this question, You think that we are so corrupt that every morning I am, Andrii Borovyk, waking up, and before brushing my teeth, I'm thinking, okay, what's corrupt stuff I'm gonna do today? Who am I gonna bribe? What the corrupt scheme I'm gonna develop? I said, no guys, this doesn't work like this. And coming back to what you said, that it is rare to develop, to be in war and develop in the democracy, but we already, I can't say, because it won't be really true, that we are progressing much with the democracy for the last 3 years, because we are in the state of war. But what makes us unique as well, there is no other country who in the state of war became the candidate to the European Union, whose now main problem, at least at this stage, of starting the full negotiations with the European Union is not within the Ukraine, but outside of Ukraine because of Hungary. So we're conducting the negotiations. We continue attempting to do the reforms because not all of them are successful. And the reforms in the sectors where for the Western democracies, it's just impossible to do it even during the peacetime, like the judicial thing. Yes, not everything is perfect, but we're doing all these three things at the same time and fighting the war. This is already very unique. And what I also must say, because we quite often do not remember that, I don't know about the democracy rankings, but I know about our corruption perception index. Usually the countries who are in the state of war going down in the ranking immediately. And this is logically fine, because all the information is closed, there is a war, there is lack of control, there is lots of useless spend of money because it all goes through the one pipe and there is lots of guys standing and trying to steal. Ukraine in corruption perception index moved up for the last 3 years, despite some step back last year, but we'll see what will be this one. And we are staying on the decent level, and all of this is quite unique, and all of this done because of our nation, because we are demanding, and the government knows this. Another example which you might not notice, in Ukraine there is a public procurement system, Prozoro. Most of the contracts go through it with competitive selection of the procurers, and it was completely stopped on the 24th of February, 2022. When it was reopened, it was starting reopening it, publishing the information and doing the competitive tenders in June 2022. And each month, it was adding more and more products which should be procured through the system. To say to somebody that, look, guys, we're in the state of war and we're still running the competitive tenders, they're saying like, yeah, this probably fine. Yeah, probably fine, but think about your state, whether they will do that.
I really couldn't agree more. And just on Prozoro, as when Andrea and I were talking before this session, one of the partners in the little firm I belong to is a former vice president of the World Bank who focused on corruption and Africa. And his comment on Prozoro, once he'd understood it, because we'd been here together last May, was that if some African nations had even a simplified version of Prozoro, a lot of the corruption that they had would be eliminated completely. So again, I think often you're not celebrating what you do have. And I'm not entirely sure I agree with the idea that you can't do democracy and war. Of course you can, you're doing it. The first thing is that you are, even if you're not opening clusters with the EU because of the very corrupt Hungary, and you've got a double problem with Hungary. One of them is it's Hungary. The other one is that a lot of EU member states are so aware of how corrupt it's become, they're very, very loath to, what they're looking at is how can we take in a new member state and ensure it doesn't go the way of Hungary? That is a very big question that is being asked amongst many people. And when I said it's Hungary, by that I mean that it has now become so obstructionist on so many issues. It's really getting on a lot of people's nerves in so many different ways, not just with relation to Ukrainian accession. But you already have a very high understanding, which you've evolved over these past 3, not to mention 11 years of war, of separation of powers. Guys, there's a lot of countries that even call themselves democracies who don't even know about the separation of powers, or it takes them a long time to attain it. I'll give you a very good example. The United Kingdom, only under the pressure of its membership in the EU, and it wasn't the reason it left the EU, but it was only under the pressure from the EU that it finally separated its judiciary from its executive, because the Supreme Court historically were the law lords who sat in the House of Lords. And for centuries, nobody saw this as being a problem at all. It was the EU that insisted that you had to have a separate Supreme Court. So don't do yourselves down. At least you understand that there's got to be a separation of powers. Not everybody does necessarily. But the point remains that you cannot play into the hands of Russia. You have to play into the hands of the EU, but not into the hands of Russia. And every time you're talking about being dishonorable, about being mismanaged, just remember that, because I think it's hugely, hugely important. Should we go for more questions? Any more questions?
Hi, thank you. I like your vision of mismanagement because it goes from very, very abstract term corruption, which Ukrainians perceive as an abstract verb and abstract word, and okay, what is corruption? I don't know. But mismanaged, it leads us to, okay, this is managerial actions done by someone, so we need someone better to lead our country. But my question is how we can move even further to show our people that, okay, this is not only operational decisions, but it's also values of the person who is taking decisions. So do you have any ideas how to go from corruption, mismanagement, and then to the concept of values of the person? So people understand, okay, we need to see who we elect, for example, what he stands on, and then we will go to fighting corruption and so on.
I think that, first of all, I'm not sure it's about elections because you're at war and I don't know when you're going to have elections. So if you wait for that, you're going to be waiting a long time, it seems to me. I think the issue is more trying to do something together as a nation. The reason I'm bringing that up is one of the best examples I've ever seen. I remember this from when I was a young woman in Israel, and many shops didn't have a cash register. And it meant that nobody could really keep track of what they were selling and not selling, okay? So they could make up their thing, and you just got a chit with, handwritten and whatever. And the government of the day ran a very good campaign that said, I don't know, on the 1st of May or whenever it was, it's not so much that every shop must have a cash register, but we're all going to ask for receipts. And stunningly enough, within a month, it just became standard because everybody started asking for receipts. So it was a collective action, a consciousness action of the whole community, I think, which made it a very different thing than coming from above or being told something. I think maybe one thing that you have to start thinking about is how can you be proactive as a society beyond going to demos? You've achieved the big thing, but sometimes you need to do actions together that aren't just militant. They have to be pro something. And maybe we should be thinking together in those terms, because again, I think it's much more difficult to counter you when you're doing something that is proactive for a positive thing than when you're fighting something. So you're fighting a war and you're fighting corruption and, and maybe you need to think about, we want a better managed country, or we together will manage it better, or we will take responsibility together for something. Because what are you saying when you take when you ask for a chit, or you ask for a proper receipt from a cash machine? You're saying, I'm taking responsibility. I've paid you, and I want to be able to show because I want to be able to show my accountant that I've paid. So I'm not saying it's an overnight result, but I am saying that you really need a much stronger understanding within yourselves of what it is that you also want to fight for, not just what you're fighting against.
I would just say that I disagree with you that corruption is not a specific term. There is many definitions of what corruption is. Yeah, the shortest one, which is used in our organization, is abuse of entrusted power for a private gain. There is another definitions which say it's a criminal offense and blah blah blah. And it's, I don't know, for me it's quite specific that somebody who are in power decided to put some more money in favor of somebody in not very competitive way or in favor of himself. But mismanagement, I don't know. I haven't washed my cup with this, and I forgot to wash my cup after I drink the coffee at home. Is it a mismanagement? I don't know. The mismanagement, you can name everything as a mismanagement. But the corruption, last 30 years, it has lots of very specific terms. And I think that if we will start just using the mismanagement thing, we might be trapped in a situation when the level of the corruption will increase. Because corruption definitely has a very negative feeling when you're talking about it. Mismanagement is like, I don't know, yeah, some fluffy rabbit did something wrong. It's a mismanagement. But when you're talking about the corruption, I personally thinking about something disgusting. I'm thinking about the lives. For me, it's about the blood. It's about the amount of medicine which was not bought by the state for those who need it for, I know, and it's another dead person at the battlefield or someone's dead granny because she didn't receive the treatment for cancer. So this is about the lives. Mismanagement is about the process. There is mismanagement, okay, process will be fixed and everything will be fine. So I don't think that we can completely remove the word corruption and leave only mismanagement. But what we definitely need to do, because this is not the issue of last 3 years, as was said, it's the issue of last 30 years. There is another thing which can help us, and it's also about the generation of working on this, of different groups of people, and you and me and all of us. It's about critical thinking. When you read something and you start immediately thinking that this is a mismanagement, use critical thinking to think maybe this is a corruption, or and vice versa. You're thinking that's reading something, just critical thinking, and that's what's actually Russia using as well. That's the thing about which we were talking even before the full-scale invasion a lot, that the Russians, through the Telegram, through the TikTok, they're using different narratives, not only about the corruption, about others, about giving you less of trust. In the 90s, it was about publishing different wiretappings and other things. This time, they're using just and labeling everything as a corruption or mismanagement. But using the critical thinking can get you closer to the reality. We should not be trapped in a situation that we will start believing there is no corruption and that some people who are becoming wealthier and wealthier from year to year just because they have an access to the state budget are just mismanaging their life and not corrupting the officials. Because when we will start just avoiding the problem, the same like with your health, when you're just ignoring the problem, that was actually now our leadership doing, I was saying about that, then this problem tend to grow. We shouldn't allow this happen.
I'm not disagreeing with you in any way, shape or form. I'm saying that, first of all, labeling everything corruption is the Russian way. And actually, they're corrupt, not you guys. Of course there's corruption.
But look, they're corrupt and this is fine. Let them be corrupt. It helps us at this point.
But one of the ways they're saying that you're not independent and you can't be a different nation is that you're both corrupt. And that's why it's very important to make this differentiation. Because, so don't call it mismanagement. First of all, I'd call it bad management and I'd call it dishonorable. As I say, dishonorable is a very strong word, and bad management, rather, mismanagement, can I agree with you, can mean, you didn't intend to, but hey, it happened. Bad management has got a much worse connotation. You badly managed that. You knew that there was a good way to do it, and you did it badly, and you did it dishonorably. But the more you carry on using corruption, then the more you're also letting them believe that you're actually the same.
That's why we need to also remember not only about the bad stuff, but about our achievements as well. A few years ago, there was an ambassador of Canada in Ukraine, Roman Vashuk. He's still here, but in a different role now. And I remember that he was saying that Ukrainians are always unhappy. So when the reform is not done for 101%, but for 99%, it's not done. It's horrible. Think about it. Think what you're reading on the news as well. This is not a blame to the journalists, but you tend to open those headlines which has something, there is a corruption for $100 million there, rather than opening the news that, look, something good happened. So we should convince ourselves, first of all, that we have lots of achievements, at least for the last 10 years. That's where I'm following all of that. That's why I'm talking last 10 years. We should celebrate those achievements. That's how they have a chance, those reforms have a chance to survive in a longer term, when we will admit that this reform, like everybody is admitting that DA is a wonderful thing in our phones, right? But why we not admitting the other stuffs? So celebrating our victories is important. Understanding that life is not perfect, and sometimes things cannot be done for 100%, but for 90%, and this is fine. Let's think about the next move, what we're going to do next. So yeah, and of course, I will repeat again and again, Ukraine is not a corrupt country. Ukraine is a country that is fighting with the corruption. Sometimes successful, sometimes is not, but we are alive, we are fighting, we are moving, we are not static. And this is already a sign that we are developing, and this, by the way, I just thought may be a sign that we are a developing democracy. Because even during the war, we have the freedom of talking about the corruption here, and freedom about reading about the corruption in the media as well, and freedom of, yes, with some pushbacks, sometimes it happens from the officials' different levels, but we have wonderful investigative journalists who continue doing their job, at the same time talking about the Russian atrocities in Ukraine and about the corruption in the country. During the war, when the whole information should be closed, and they not tend to believe that a national marathon, this is a thing, but still, in the old-fashioned strategies, it should be like this, that all the media is under control of the government. It's not like this with us. And this is a sign of our democracy. That's what makes us definitely differ from our enemies.
Yeah, more questions. Gosh.
Yeah, you've spoken about the important role that Ukrainian investigative journalists, the important role they play in exposing corruption, mismanagement in Ukraine. Is there any role for foreign journalists to do the same, but with the audience being in the UK or in Europe? Yeah.
Let's take a few questions together, maybe, and then we can...
Thanks. Not a question, just a brief comment. When we speak, and I personally have been on the meetings when we speak about some sort of mismanagement or bad management, foreigners react like one step away of labeling us failed state. So if it's a failed state, why we are helping them? Because they are mismanaged. Whereas corruption is a more specific term. And I would personally prefer using not a corruption as for the whole country, but communicating certain cases of corrupt actions, which is very smaller than the whole world corruption. But I personally feel like that mismanagement has more risks for us as we depend on the foreign aid.
Yeah. No. Your question is about whether the foreign journalists can do the investigation about the Ukrainian corruption and communicate it to your audience. Is it helpful to us regarding the support from your government? I guess no. But why? But who would dare to limit investigative journalists from London coming to Kiev and writing about the corruption here? What is it? Whether it will help us? No. But I usually saying, guys, but the journalist, this is his job to do that. And in order for him not doing that, do not do the Corruption Act, and there will be nothing to write about. This is simple. Sounds simple, but it's hard. So why not?
I would start out by asking you why you would come to Ukraine. Do you go to France to write about corruption? Do you go to the US? I mean, now you can go to the US to write about corruption, lots to write about. But you're coming here to write about corruption, which in itself says a lot. And as I said right at the very beginning, keep in mind that every time you write about it, because you really want to expose either a problem or show that maybe things are advancing, you're just giving Russia more data to work against, to turn it against you. And that is a very, very big problem, because if I'm bringing this conversation back to the beginning, then that's the issue that we're talking about. If this wasn't a state at war, it wouldn't matter. What matters is that everything that is being said about corruption, everything that is being said about uncovering corruption, is being used as part of a narrative which is part of the actual strategy of Russia. It's not a little side thing. It is part of their strategy to make the world and to make Ukrainians believe that you are so corrupt that you cannot be independent and you should not be helped.
Hello.
And that is the part that upsets me.
I'm an Australian. I'm a freelance journalist. I've been coming here since July 22. Australia has very low corruption. It's really not tolerated in Australia. So you notice a very big contrast in Ukraine. It has high corruption relative to Australia. I think Russia, I've been in too. Russia has even higher corruption than Ukraine. So it's somewhere in between Australia and Russia. I've experienced corruption personally in Ukraine. I think the two comments I'd make is there's not good statistics on corruption in Ukraine. You need to have a measuring stick of how much corruption there is and a monitoring of incidents of corruption and indexes and nationally track it. And in this presentation, there's been no statistics quoted. It's just a discussion of corruption. We need to say, on what measure of what indexes is there corruption? Is it 30% corruption? Is it 40%? Is it 20%? Is it going up? Is it going down? And then the other thing that really shocks me as an Australian and as a journalist is that the corruption is not being taken seriously in the war. And that even in wartime, there's corruption. I would have thought it would be stamped out. And I think the biggest problem is insufficient investigations and in particular insufficient consequences. And that you can have major corruption uncovered here and then someone gets let off lightly or gets a small prison sentence where there's diversion of funds that are going to the war and soldiers are dying at the front as a result of that corruption. And in a wartime in Britain and in World War II, this kind of people would be executed. And I haven't heard of anyone being executed for corruption in Ukraine.
You start.
Yeah, but I will start with the previous about the journalists. Just a quick reminder to all of us that from the February 2022 to around November 2022, you will not find any journalistic material or CSO material about the corruption in Ukraine. There was none of it. Not because there was no corruption, but it was kind of unwritten pact between us and the government that you're fighting the Russia and we not talking about your corrupted actions or mistakes now because we need to save the state. Then this self-censorship, and many journalists admit that it was a self-censorship, was going down, and it was finally broken completely when the first corruption scandal happened with the procurement of food for the military. It was around January, February 2023. Why? Because the Ukrainians see, I mean, at least the CSOs, we see that this corruption doesn't help us to, it undermines our abilities to fight with the Russia. So it doesn't give us additional weapon, it's just taking the weapon from us. That's why we need to talk and to write and to fight with it. Publicity is still one of the major instruments to fight with it. That's why Ukrainians doing this. So that's really a good question. Why would you come to Ukraine to write it? For what? We're talking about this because we want this problem going down. Foreign journalists coming here to write about it, communicate it to your government. Would it push your government to help us more on fighting the corruption? Maybe somebody, but most likely no. But again, this is a freedom of the journalism and freedom of you doing, any journalist do what that they must do. I think that there is always a level of critical thinking when it's chosen the material. Coming back to the next comment about we need to measure the corruption. Unfortunately, this is impossible. There were lots of I witnessed for 9 years, or lots of different attempts how to measure the level of corruption in the country. We have our corruption perception index that has lots of drawbacks. It's not perfect at all. I know all its minuses. It's only about the perception, only the perception at the state level. We are not talking about the corruption at the business level. So there is lots of limitations. There were attempts to measure the corruption in the sense of money, but it was also failed. So just to say that this country is 30% corrupt, another one is 90% corrupt, it's there will be in the methodology there always will be lots of loopholes to say that it is wrong. So it's just really completely impossible. If talking about the numbers, for the last 5 years, Ukraine has our high anti-corruption court issued more than 300 convictions. There's dozens of people staying were imprisoned. And this is a good result. But my question is whether we should concentrate on punishment and put in more people in jail. Would it help us? Or we need to think what should be the priority, prevention of corruption or punishment of corruption? Punishment looks more good for the headlines in the news. Prevention, you would never find any news about the prevention because it's harder to measure, but it might have a wider influence. So it's always a part of the debate.
I agree with you. Are there any more questions?
It's not a question, it's just a comment. So when I was asking the question about corruption, mismanagement and values, it was not like to say corruption is not a good term. And we both understand what this term means. But I was asking more about, for example, my father. When I have conversations with my father, it's a nightmare how to explain him what is corruption. And this is not everyone is corrupt in our authority, they are bad, I am good, and so on. So it was just how to explain on very, very operational and day-to-day level what is corruption. And this dishonest, bad management, I think this is for me, for example, this is the key, how to explain, okay, this is not good what you are doing. This is a part of that bad word corruption that you were saying before. Thank you.
Maybe I would add to that, as we're coming towards the end of this session, two things. One very specific thing, which members of our team were in Warsaw in November, and somebody there gave a wonderful example. Given that all of these countries, the former Soviet countries, were all basically controlled by Russia, right? So a gentleman, his wife had been very ill. A doctor helped, provided wonderful care. She was much better. And he'd gone to thank him, and it was close to Christmas, so he'd also taken an envelope with a Christmas card in it. And probably, if for anybody over a certain age here, I can see you're already smiling, then he says, thank you very much, and it's very kind of you, and all the rest of it. And he tries to give him the envelope. Because in the Soviet system, you always took an envelope which had some money in it, because that's how you got whatever you needed wherever you went. And the doctor was like, no, we don't do envelopes anymore. Please, no, thank you. And he had to open it and show him, look, it's a Christmas card, really. But what the man was saying was it took at least 10 years after they joined the EU for this to change. That this was the mentality, the old Soviet mentality that needed changing. The other issue which we haven't brought up is just try and encourage people to actually read source material and not just what your feed gives you. Because your feed with the algorithm is very, very influenced by, especially if it's on Telegram or something like that, it will be corrupted in one way or another. And that's what you'll be reading. Go back and actually look what Transparency International is writing. Go back and look actually what other agencies are saying as opposed to the way it's being presented to you through another medium. Because it's being corrupted as it goes through it. I think that's it.
I think that's it, yeah. So be critical and celebrate the victories. Let's finish on the positive note. And thank you for coming and listening to us.
Thank you very much.